The hall was cold and bright. Rows of seats were filled with alien cadets in clean uniforms, their eyes sharp, their posture perfect. In the middle of the room stood the selection platform, a round stage where each candidate had to walk forward, give their name, and face the judgment of the fleet recruiters. When the doors at the back opened, a thin figure stepped inside. He walked slowly, almost unsure if he belonged there. His uniform was old and faded. The patches on the elbows looked like they had been sewn by hand. Carried no weapons, no medals, no signs of rank. A murmur went through the crowd. Some laughed under their breath, others whispered. The name tag read Rian Vale, but the file in the recruiter's hands was almost empty. It said, human male, no combat record, no flight school training, no special commendations. One of the alien cadets in the back leaned over to his friend and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Send him back to his farm." Laughter broke. Out across the hall, even some of the human officers smiled. Rian didn't react. He kept walking until he reached the platform and stopped in the bright light. The lead recruiter, a tall insectoid officer with glassy eyes, looked down at him and tilted his head. 0 combat hours. 0 simulation ranking. Why are you here? Rian's voice was quiet, but steady. Because you called for every able recruit, I am able. His answer brought another wave of laughter. One alien in the front row clapped sarcastically. He's able, all right. Able to die in the first 5 seconds? The recruiter tapped the panel beside him. Fine, show us. We'll use the training simulator. Level 1 only. Another ripple of laughter moved through the room. Rian walked to the simulator pod at the side of the hall. The machine opened with a hiss, revealing a narrow seat and a glowing control board. The other cadets leaned forward to watch, some betting on how long he would last. Sat down, pulled the harness across his chest, and closed his eyes for a moment before the visor slid down over his face. The simulation began instantly. A small patrol ship floated in space ahead of him. Enemy drones blinked into existence, forming a tight formation. At first, Rian's movements looked wrong. His ship drifted, instead of darting forward. He turned, late letting drones close in before reacting. The watchers laughed again. Doesn't even know which way to point the nose, someone muttered. But then the first drone exploded. Then the second. The laughter faded a little. Rian's flight path was strange, weaving in slow arcs, letting the drones chase him before turning sharply and hitting them at close range. The instructors in the corner exchanged looks. His reaction time was slow by normal standards, yet his accuracy was perfect. The drone counter dropped from 10 to 5 to 2. The final drone tried to retreat, but Rian had already predicted its escape vector. A single shot ended the simulation. The visor lifted. Rian opened his eyes and stepped out of the pod without looking at the audience. No one clapped, but no one laughed now. The recruiter stared at the score on his panel. Unusual, he said, softly and impossible for a first-timer. But before he could ask a question, the alarm in the real station began to sound. The sharp rising tone echoed through the hall, followed by a deep automated voice announcing a border breach. The instructors stood quickly. Cadets turned to each other in confusion. The main screen on the wall switched to a live feed from the outer sensors. Dark shapes moved at the edge of the system. A junior officer rushed into the room. "Sir, we have enemy scouts inside the defense line. We have no ships ready to intercept." The recruiter turned to his team. "Get the senior pilots." The officer shook his head. "They're out on maneuvers. We have minutes before the scouts scan the station." The insectoid recruiter looked at Rian. The human stood quietly, hands at his sides, eyes fixed on the moving dots on the screen. "You," the recruiter said, pointing. "You just left the simulator. You can fly a real ship?" Rian's answer was the same steady tone as before. "I can try." The room was silent. No one laughed now. The recruiter's glassy eyes blinked twice before he gave a short nod. "Get him to Bay 3. The cadets stared as Rian followed the officer out of the hall. Some shook their heads, certain they had just witnessed a man walk to his death. Others were silent, a small unease growing in their minds. Outside, in the blackness of space, the enemy shapes grew larger. The game was over. This was real. The red warning lights flashed across the station walls, painting the metal corridors in a steady pulse of danger. Sirens wailed in a long, rising cry that seemed to seep into the bones of everyone inside. Rian followed the officer at a quick pace, his boots thudding against the floor. The bay doors ahead loomed open, revealing the curved hulls of several patrol ships. Mechanics scrambled between them, dragging cables and slamming panels shut. None of the ships looked ready for battle. The officer stopped at the smallest craft in the row. It was scratched, its paint worn away in patches, and the left thruster showed signs of being replaced recently. "This one will fly," the officer said, sounding more hopeful than certain. Ariane climbed the short ladder and stepped inside. The cockpit was cramped, the seat molded for someone taller. The controls felt heavier than the simulators, but his hands settled naturally on the grips. He didn't wait for instructions. Systems came online with a deep hum as he tapped the activation sequence. The canopy sealed over him with a hiss. Through the glass, he saw mechanics waving him toward the launch strip. The bay's massive outer doors began to open, revealing the black void of space dotted with stars. The siren shifted pitch. The enemy scouts had entered visual range. Rian's display flickered to life, showing 3 small enemy craft moving in tight formation. The patrol ships that should have been defending the station were gone, still hours away on training runs. It was just him. The voice of the recruiter crackled in his earpiece. "Listen carefully. Do not engage directly. Shadow them and feed us data." He eased the throttle forward and felt the patrol ship glide into space. The enemy scouts noticed him almost immediately. Their formation broke, 2 angling toward him while the 3rd moved toward the station. Rian's mind worked quickly. They scanned the station. They would know its defenses were down. He had to stop them now. He accelerated toward an asteroid field nearby. Chunks of rock, from pebble-sized to mountain-sized, drifted slowly in a lazy orbit. Any pilot would avoid it. Jan dove straight in. Behind him, the enemy ships followed, their weapons firing short bursts that flared harmlessly against distant stone. He let them think they were herding him deeper into danger, and cut speed sharply and twisted through a narrow gap between 2 tumbling rocks. One enemy craft tried to follow but clipped its wing on a boulder and exploded in a flash of fire. The second was more careful, but Rian reversed thrusters suddenly, letting the pursuer shoot past him. A quick burst from his cannons shattered its engine. The 3rd scout, now realizing the trap, tried to pull away and make for open space. Rian pushed his engines hard, swinging wide through the asteroid belt to intercept. The ship shook from the stress, alarms warning him of overheating thrusters. But he didn't slow down. He cut in front of the fleeing scout, forcing it to veer right directly into a slow-moving wall of rock the size of a city block. The scout's pilot tried to avoid it, but the asteroid's shadow swallowed the craft before it smashed apart. Breathing steady, Rian guided his ship out of the field. The recruiter's voice returned, quieter now. "You destroyed all 3 scouts? That was unexpected." But Rian wasn't looking at the wreckage. His eyes were fixed on his long-range scanner. Beyond the edge of the asteroid field, faint signals blinked too many to count. They weren't scouts. They were larger, slower, waiting, a fleet. He switched off his transmitter. No one else needed to know yet, not until he was sure. The enemy wasn't retreating. They were just beginning. The station had returned to its usual rhythm, but for Rian, the noise of the crowd felt far away. Pilots laughed in the mess hall, instructors barked at trainees, and the hum of machinery echoed in the corridors, yet all of it seemed muted. His mind was fixed on the faint readings he had seen on his scanner. Ships that size didn't move in small numbers, and they didn't linger without a reason. The enemy was hiding, waiting for the right moment. He was certain of it. That night, while the others slept or spent their credits in the recreation decks, Rian sat alone in the dim light of the navigation room. He had pulled the patrol ship's flight recorder and plugged it into one of the unused consoles. The data appeared on the screen, a map of the asteroid field, the destroyed scouts, and then faint and almost buried in static, the cluster of distant signals. He zoomed in slowly. Shapes formed, long heavy holes, warships. He replayed the scanner logs 3 times, but the results didn't change. His fingers tapped on the console as he considered what to do. If he took this to the command council, they would laugh again. They had already written him off as an accident, a fluke. They wouldn't send the fleet into motion over a guess from a new recruit. Still, doing nothing wasn't an option. He leaned back in the chair and stared at the flickering screen, thinking of how the scouts had chased him. They hadn't been hunting him out of pride. They were trying to keep him away from the fleet's position. The door behind him slid open with a soft hiss. Rian turned to see a tall, scaled alien in the dark green uniform of the station's strategy division. Her narrow eyes studied him for a moment before she stepped inside and closed the door. "You're not supposed to be in here," she said. Calmly, her voice was quiet, but there was no anger in it, only curiosity. Rian didn't try to explain. He simply turned the console so she could see the readings. She walked closer, leaning over the data with sharp interest. "These patterns," she murmured. "No one else would notice. But they are real." She introduced herself as Commander Syra, one of the few officers who specialized in enemy fleet movements. Admitted she had been watching him since the simulator test. "The others think you are just lucky," she said, "but I have seen this before pilots who see the field differently." She warned him not to show this to the council yet. If you bring them this without proof, they will ignore you. Worse, they will erase the data. Over the next few days, Rian and Syra worked in secret. They used maintenance requests as excuses to take smaller ships out near the asteroid belt, scanning at different ranges and angles. Each time, they found more evidence. The fleet was there, large, silent, and patient. It was waiting for something. On their 5th run, Syra caught a faint transmission between 2 enemy ships. It was encrypted, but the timing told her all she needed to know. "They're coordinating," she said. And soon. The night they returned from that run, the station lights dimmed for the sleep cycle. Rian lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts were a storm. If the enemy moved now, the station would be the first to fall, and no reinforcements would arrive in time. He had proof now, but he still didn't know how to make anyone listen. The next morning, before the station fully woke, the outer sensor alarms chirped softly. Not the blaring of a full attack, just a whisper, too quiet for the command deck to take seriously, but Rian was already in the hangar by the time the message scrolled across the main screens. Unidentified shadows detected at system edge. He knew what they were. And he knew the waiting was almost over. The order came at midnight. A sharp tone buzzed through the station's comms, followed by the voice of an officer calling all senior pilots to the main briefing hall. Rian was not on that list, but when he stepped out into the corridor, he found Syra already waiting. She didn't say a word, only tilted her head toward the lift. He followed her without question. They moved through the dim, half-sleeping corridors until the lift doors opened into the high-ceilinged strategy chamber. Inside, the air was tense. Large screens showed sensor feeds from the edge of the system. Shapes moved against the starfield, dozens of them, each marked with enemy identifiers. Rian's eyes swept the display. The enemy fleet was no longer hiding. It was coming. Senior officers stood in a wide arc around the central table, speaking in clipped tones, pointing at maps, arguing over intercept positions. The commander of the station, a broad-shouldered reptilian veteran, slammed his fist against the table. "We meet them head-on. It's all available ships to the primary line. No diversions." Rian frowned. Meeting the fleet head-on was suicide. Enemies' numbers were too high, their ships heavier and better armed. He looked to Syra, but she kept her expression calm. She waited until the room's noise dipped, then spoke. "There is another way. You can use the asteroid belt as a shield. Let them chase a smaller force through it. We hit them from behind when their formation breaks." The room erupted again, some scoffing, some openly dismissing her. "This is not the time for risky stunts," one alien captain said. "We need solid lines and concentrated fire." Silra's eyes flicked toward Rian. She didn't need to speak for him to know it was his moment. He stepped forward. "But you're thinking too small." The captains turned to stare at him, some with open irritation. "Who are you?" one demanded. "Rian Vale," Syra answered before he could. The one who destroyed the scouts? A murmur went through the group. Rian pointed at the map. The asteroids aren't just cover, they're weapons. Drift in predictable patterns. If we time our approach, we can sling our ships with gravity pulls and speed boosts. It can be faster than they expect. We can force their heavy cruisers into positions where they can't fire without hitting their own ships. The commander narrowed his eyes. That's not fleet doctrine. Rian met his gaze. Doctrine won't save you when they outgun you 2-1. The silence that followed was heavy. Several officers shook their heads, unwilling to trust a recruit with no rank. But Sealra stepped forward. Give him a chance. Strike group. If he fails, you've lost nothing you wouldn't have already. The commander stared at them for a long moment before finally nodding. Fine. A small mixed unit. You have 1 hour to prepare. Rian left the chamber with Syra at his side, the map already burned into his memory. In the hangar, his new crew gathered a mix of skeptical human pilots, curious alien gunners, and engineers who muttered under their breath about doomed missions. He didn't waste time explaining. We're going into the belt, he told them. Stay close, follow my lead, and no one dies today. An hour later, their ships launched into the black. The enemy fleet grew on the scanners, its sheer size. A wall of moving metal. Rian's pulse was steady. The plan was dangerous, maybe impossible. But as the asteroids loomed ahead, drifting in their silent, endless dance, he knew this was exactly where he needed to be. The laughter from the draft. Hall felt like another lifetime. Now there was only the fight. The hangar was still buzzing with the afterglow of victory when the new orders came in. Rian's strike group had just returned from the asteroid belt, their hulls scorched but intact, their mission a success. They had torn through the enemies. Forward cruisers, forcing the main fleet to halt and regroup. Crews were slapping each other on the back, engineers rushing to patch damage, pilots boasting about impossible shots. But the mood shifted the instant the cum officer ran in with a pale face and a datapad in hand. Orders from Earth Command, she said, her voice tight. Your fleet is to stand down. Return to station immediately. No further engagement. The words landed like cold stone in Rian's chest. Around him, the pilots looked confused, some even angry. The enemy was wounded. This was their chance to push harder, to break them before they regrouped. Yet the command from home was clear. Do nothing. Rian walked toward the cum officer and read the order himself. The wording was strange. No acknowledgement of their victory. No strategic reason for the halt. Just an absolute directive to hold position and withdraw. He didn't believe it for a second. Sylar appeared at his side, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the message. This is wrong, she said quietly. Too precise, too clean. Someone doesn't want us to finish the job. That suspicion became certainty when the long-range sensors lit up with enemy movement. Not retreat, but a cautious advance. Scouts were already slipping between the asteroids, heading toward the unguarded core worlds. If they obeyed Earth's command, the enemy would have free passage. Rian stood in the center of the hangar, his voice cutting through the noise. We move now. We hit their supply lines before they can regroup. Some of the crew hesitated, disobeying. A direct order from Earth could mean court-martial, prison, or worse. But the faces around him began to harden. The pilots he had led through the belt knew what would happen if they stayed idle. Engines roared to life as his fleet lifted off without clearance. They dove back into the belt, cutting through its drifting. Stone giants until they reached the coordinates Syra had pinpointed. There, nestled in the shadow of a fractured moon, were the enemy supply ships, fat, slow targets, carrying fuel and ammunition. The strike was swift and brutal. Explosions rippled through the enemy formation, fuel lines igniting, cargo bays tearing apart. By the time the enemy realized what was happening, half their supply force was gone, and the rest was scattering into the void. But the victory came with a cost. On the way back, Rian's flagship jolted violently as alarms blared. Sabotage. The engineering crew found a timed explosive tucked near the main reactor, set to detonate before they reached the station. They disarmed it with seconds to spare, but the truth was clear. The enemy had help from inside, Spy had not only fed orders to Earth Command, but had boarded his ship. Silra's voice was cold when she said someone here wanted you dead. Before you could return, the thought lingered as they approached the station, where a fleet of military escorts waited to surround them. Over the comms, the voice of the station commander came sharp and formal. Rion Vale. You are under arrest for disobeying orders. Power down your ships immediately. Rion stared at the looming hangar doors. Behind them, the main battle was about to begin, and the people giving orders were the same ones telling him to stand down. His hands tightened on the controls. If he powered down now, the war would be lost before it began. The comm channel crackled with the commander's voice, sharp and final. Power down your ships, Rion Vale. This is your last warning. Around him, the pilots of his strike group waited for his decision. Engines hummed. Weapons were armed. And the black space beyond the station was lit with the faint gleam of the approaching enemy fleet. Rion could see it in the distance, a wall of metal stretching across the stars, moving steadily toward them. He knew the truth now. Command was compromised. If he surrendered, the fleet would fall without a fight. He took a slow breath and opened a private channel to his crew. You followed me through the belt. You disobeyed orders to save lives. If you trust me one more time, we will end this here. There was no hesitation in their replies. With you, Captain, one human pilot said. Till the end, another. Voice added, deep and alien. Rion cut the public channel and turned his fleet away from the station. The escorts tried to block them, but his ships accelerated hard, slipping into open space before the station's guns could fire. The enemy fleet loomed closer now. Rion's hands moved quickly across the controls, plotting a course through the asteroid belt and back out into the enemy's flank. We're going to make them think we're running, he told his crew. Then we're going to trap them. The first phase went smoothly. His ships darted into the belt, weaving between drifting stone as the enemy pursued. They're heavier. Cruisers had to slow down, breaking their perfect formation. That was when Rion's hidden trap took shape. He had ordered earlier mining drones in the belt to attach explosives to key asteroids, setting them to detonate when triggered. At his signal, the asteroids shattered in a chain of violent bursts. Shards the size of buildings tore through the enemy formation, splitting it in two. Rion's fleet spun around in the chaos, hitting the smaller group with concentrated fire. Enemy ships erupted in flames, their crews unprepared for the sudden reversal. But the larger half of the fleet was still advancing. And at its center was the enemy command ship, a massive spined fortress, bristling with weapons. Rion knew they couldn't outgun it. They would have to end it in one move. All ships. Focus fire on its forward shields, he ordered. Explosions flared along the command ship's bow, drawing its attention. As its guns turned toward his fleet, Rion pushed his own ship into a steep dive. Engines screaming, heading straight for the ship's underbelly. His crew didn't question him. They understood. The last second, he engaged the reactor's overload sequence and locked the controls. The ship shot forward like a spear, smashing into the enemy's heart. The detonation lit up the void, the shockwave rattling even the farthest ships in his fleet. When the light faded, the enemy command ship was gone, replaced by drifting wreckage. The remaining enemy vessels faltered, their formation collapsing without leadership. One by one, they turned and retreated into the darkness. The war was not over, but the invasion was broken. Back at the station, silence greeted their return. The same officers who had laughed at Rion during the draft now stood in formal lines, saluting as he walked down the hangar ramp. The commander of the station met his eyes, saying nothing, but his salute was sharp. Rion didn't smile. He only glanced at his surviving crew and the ships behind them, battered but alive. He had never asked to lead, but when the galaxy needed him, he had. Been ready, now they all knew it. The station had gone quiet after the battle, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the heavy, watchful silence of people waiting for the next move. Wreckage still drifted at the system's edge, slowly pulled apart by gravity. Inside, crews worked without rest, repairing holes, patching systems, and bringing damaged ships back to life, and walked the main hangar. Every step followed by eyes that once looked at him with doubt, but now was something else. respect, and maybe a little fear. High Command had not sent congratulations, no medals, no public thanks. Only a single encrypted message had arrived from Earth. It was short. Stand by for reassignment. Rian read it twice, feeling the unease grow. It didn't sound like they were offering him a choice. Syra approached, a datapad in her hand. Our intercept on that last transmission before the battle, she said, handing it to him. It's worse than we thought. The intercepted data showed more than one enemy fleet. The one they had broken was only an advance group. The real force was still out there, gathering. Rian studied the map. The enemy's path would bypass most of the core defenses and strike deep into Allied territory before anyone could respond. He closed the datapad slowly. We won the first fight, he said, but the war hasn't even started. Silra's eyes narrowed. And Command still wants you out of the picture. They'll reassign you to some training post on the far edge of nowhere. That night, while the station's lights dimmed for rest cycle, Rian sat in the dark of the observation deck. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, the enemy was already moving. He knew if he waited for official orders, it would be too late. The choice was becoming clear: disobey again or watch everything they'd fought. For fall apart, he didn't have to decide alone. One by one, members of his strike group joined him on the deck, silent at first, then speaking in low voices. If you're going, we're going, a pilot said. Orders or no orders. Another, an alien gunner with scars across his neck, added, We're not done yet, Captain. Rian looked at them, their faces lit by the cold light of distant suns. They weren't just following him out of loyalty. They knew the truth now, the same as he did. High Command wasn't going to save them. If the galaxy had any chance left, it would be because of the fleet he had built from the ones who believed. By dawn cycle, the decision was made. Ships were already being fueled quietly, supplies loaded without paperwork, launch codes prepared. In silence. When the station woke fully, Rian's fleet would be gone, heading straight into the dark toward the real enemy. And this time, no one would be laughing, ChatGPT.